Sean Leslie.
Well, it took the government in Kenya several days to finally put an end to the siege, the terrorist attack on the Westgate Mall in Nairobi. Last death toll I saw, 68 people dead, but I'm sure there are still more bodies to be counted. This the responsibility of the Al-Qaeda-linked group Al-Shabab. What were they trying to achieve from their perspective? Was it a success? Max Abrahms joins us now. Mr. Abrahms, a terrorism expert and political science professor at Northeastern University. Max Abrahms, hello.
Hello, happy to be with you.
Thanks for being back on the show. Appreciate it. Give us a little bit of background here. Who is Al-Shabab and what were they trying to achieve with this attack in Kenya?
Right. So, I mean, this is a very big question. People want to know from the perspective of Al-Shabab, was this attack a success? And one of the reasons why they want to know that is because there's this assumption that terrorists, like most other people, are rational actors. And so if they deem something to be successful, that's particularly worrisome because then presumably they'd be likely to replicate these kinds of attacks. Now, when we're evaluating whether or not a terrorist attack is successful, we can evaluate it in many different ways. The most obvious way to evaluate it would be whether the attack was operationally successful. And by that score, I think that there's little doubt that indeed it was. The terrorists were, of course, able to, penetrate the mall, the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, and kill, 68 people and still counting.
Yeah.
It certainly scared a lot of people. The attack drew a lot of attention to the group. Prior to this attack, most people thought of Al-Shabab as, a relatively localized actor. But because the attack took place outside of Somalia, inside Kenya, and it attacked a sort of an international area of commerce, more countries, more citizens internationally are afraid that Al-Shabaab is going to go global. So in that sense, the attack was successful. But I would argue that in many other ways, the attack will not be successful. Indeed, the political consequences of the attack will be negative from the standpoint of the terrorist group. What's happened is that the locals in that area have rallied to the side of the government, and they've rallied against the terrorist perpetrators. And so support for the terrorist group has eroded. Support for the government opposition has increased. And this is a terrorist group that depends to a large extent on international funding. Many of the members, particularly in the leadership, come from different countries. And, internationally, people are, of course, appalled by this kind of violence. So I think that the net result will be negative politically for the group, even though it was able to score sort of a short-term operational success.
But if I'm watching this from the West and I worry that, well, they're going to get all sorts of recruits now from across the Middle East, from across Northern Africa, and maybe they take their experiences in Kenya and start looking at malls in the West, whether they look at malls in Europe or in North America. Could we see that? Should we be concerned about that?
A couple of days ago, the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, I think in trying to allay fears, in the United States that Al-Shabaab would strike the United States, said that he didn't think that the group had the capability to do so. And I respectfully disagree. The reality is that it's very easy to create havoc, particularly in a democratic country. It doesn't really require very much capability at all to have an operationally successful attack. This attack at the Westgate Mall was actually quite sophisticated. They had machine guns,
yes.
They had a number of men, they had grenades. It was well planned out. The target was well chosen. Indeed, the government forces had a really tough time, getting control of the situation. It took them about 3 days. And so a group with this kind of capability anywhere in the world, in a globalized society, I think that certainly Al-Shabaab would be able to mount operations in North America as well. The question is whether it is really not so much over capability, but over intent. Does the group want to expand operations in that fashion? And the concern, of course, from their perspective, would be that if Al-Shabab were to, say, attack the American homeland, you'd probably find some drone strikes raining down on the leadership of the group. U.S. involvement would probably increase. And so, yeah, the group has some tough decisions to make, but I do think it would pay dearly to expand operations to the American homeland.
Although one has to say that a mall in your country or mine, Max Abrams, is a pretty soft target, and it's pretty easy to obtain guns and explosives in both our countries.
Absolutely. I mean, we in democracies, again, we're sitting ducks for this sort of thing.
Yes.
I mean, even during, Halloween, that's not terrorism, but you have kids running around and, it's just low-level vandalism and damage. That kind of, interruption to society is the price that we have to pay for our freedoms. And so given the sophistication of this group, I have no doubt that it has the capability to wreak havoc overseas as well.
It's just whether they want to. What were the motives in singling out non-Muslims for execution? I had understood that Al-Shabab was upset with the involvement of Kenya and other African countries in intervening in the strife in Somalia. So then why are they going around picking off people who don't happen to be the same religion as them?
Yeah, when we talk about human beings, just, people, there's a general understanding that people often have mixed motives for things. They're not just driven by a single motive. And yet, for whatever reason, when people start talking about terrorist groups, they want to reduce their motives to just one single factor. And that's really inaccurate to do. The reality is that almost all terrorist groups have, multiple motives because they're comprised of people, of course. And in the case of Al-Shabab, they have a number of different motives. Yes, it's true that the group is nationalist. They want to take over Somalia.
Right.
And they've been battling the government there. They had some previous success, particularly in the south of the country, but then suffered some losses from the government. And so Al-Shabaab has sort of expanded operations into Kenya because the Kenyan government started getting involved in counterterrorism operations within Somalia. So in that sense, the attack on the Nairobi Mall could be understood as nationalist. On the other hand, you're quite right that the perpetrators were most interested in killing non-Muslims. And the reason is because even though the group is nationalist, it's also Islamist. And so it's sort of nationalism suffused with this Islamist orientation, which actually really isn't that uncommon. There are many other terrorist groups that operate, more or less in the same way. A group that's more well-known, for example, is Hezbollah.
Yes.
Hezbollah is a terrorist group that's based in Lebanon, but it's also a proxy of Iran, and so the group is called the Party of God. And so they want to spread, Shia Islam throughout the area. It's very similar to this group. Indeed, Al-Qaeda is very skillful at sort of latching on to nationalist struggles. And when that happens, it tends to, it wants to spread Sunni Islam, particularly their radical interpretation, and wreak havoc locally as well.
I am sure that we will hear more from Al-Shabab. Max Abrahms, always good to have you on the show.